The rain poured down that night, washing away any trace on the empty streets. A frantic call from a 7-Eleven downtown Greenwich sent the police team into action, but something felt wrong from the start. When they cornered the suspect, an unexpected event occurred. Their K9 didn't just stop, it reacted in a bizarre way, leaving everything unclear. And when the suspect whispered a name, the officers realized the truth wasn't as simple as they thought. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. No more waiting. The story begins right now. Stay tuned. The call had come in minutes earlier. A Bay 11 downtown Greenwich alarm triggering Baobangem. As Carter and Rocky pursued their target through the poorly lit streets, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a routine case. The suspect's silhouette disappeared around corners, leading them through a maze of alleyway, near arched streets and abandoned storefronts. Finally, they had him cornered. The suspect stood at the end of an alleyway near Arch Street, his hands raised above his head, breathing heavily. Carter's flashlight beam illuminated the scene, and he could see the man's face clearly now. Young, perhaps in his early 30s, with features that spoke more of fear than malice. "Rocky, forward," Carter commanded, expecting his partner to perform as he had countless times before in similar situations. But something unprecedented happened. Rocky, the department's decorated K9 officer, known for his unwavering obedience and precision, stopped dead in his tracks. His tail began to wag, and his entire demeanor changed from professional to peculiarly personal. The suspect, still holding his hands high, let out a shaky breath. "Buddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the falling rain. Carter's grip on his flashlight tightened. Buddy wasn't Rocky's designated call sign. It wasn't even close. Yet his partner's ears perked up at the name, and his tail wagged with increased enthusiasm. The dog's reaction sent a chill down Carter's spine that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through his uniform. Backup arrived moments later, and Officer Michael Harris, known throughout the department for his by-the-book approach and unwavering conviction, took charge of the scene. As Harris cuffed the suspect, Carter couldn't help but notice how Rocky's eyes never left the man's face and how the dog whimpered softly, something he'd never done before during an arrest. At the station, the suspect, who identified himself as David Anderson, maintained his innocence with a quiet dignity that made Carter uncomfortable. There was something about his story that didn't add up, but not in the way most suspect stories fail to align with reality. This felt different. An elderly woman arrived at the station, introducing herself as Mrs. Dorothy Thompson. Her presence added another layer of complexity to the already puzzling situation. "I saw everything," she declared, her voice steady despite her apparent anxiety. That young man wasn't doing anything wrong. He was helping someone in need near the store. Carter's years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that something was terribly wrong with this situation. He decided to check the store's security footage, hoping to find concrete evidence one way or the other. But when he arrived at the 7-Eleven downtown Greenwich, the manager greeted him with troubling news. The security footage from the time of the incident had mysteriously vanished. Throughout the questioning, Rocky remained unusually agitated, his behavior so out of character that other officers began to notice. The dog's eyes rarely left David, and when they did, it was only to cast meaningful glances at Carter, as if trying to communicate something crucial. As the night wore on, David began to share more of his story. He spoke of his childhood in a small town not far from Greenwich, and of a beloved puppy he had lost years ago. Buddy was just a few months old, he explained, his voice thick with emotion. One day he simply vanished from our backyard. We searched everywhere, put up posters, but he was just gone. Carter listened intently, remembering the day he'd first met Rocky. The dog had been found wandering the streets, already partially trained, but without any identification. The department's K9 unit had given him a new purpose, a new name, and a new life. But now, watching the way Rocky responded to David, Carter couldn't help but wonder if they had all been wrong about the dog's history. The night stretched on, and with each passing hour, the certainty that had defined Carter's career began to crumble. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, to trust his judgment. But now he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. The way Rocky continued to respond to David, the missing security footage, Mrs. Thompson's testimony, it all pointed to something far more complex than a simple case of mistaken identity. Back at the police station, Officer Carter sat at his desk, reviewing the details of the case for the third time that night. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he spread out the preliminary reports, something gnawing at his conscience. Rocky lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to look at the holding cell where David Anderson waited. The situation had become increasingly complex since Mrs. Thompson's arrival. Her statement painted a completely different picture of the events. According to her, she had been watching from her second-floor apartment window when she saw David helping an injured homeless man near the 711 Downtown Greenwich. He was being a good Samaritan, she had insisted, her aged hands clutching her handbag tightly. I saw him offering his jacket to the poor man, trying to help him find shelter from the rain. Officer Harris's harsh voice cut through Carter's thoughts as he passed by the desk. Don't let the dog's behavior cloud your judgment, Carter. We have a job to do. Harris had always been known for his rigid approach to law enforcement, but something about his insistence on David's guilt seemed forced, almost personal. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. He pulled up Rocky's adoption records from 5 years ago. The documentation was surprisingly sparse, a few forms marking him as a stray, basic health checks, and the initial canine training assessments. Nothing about his life before being found on the streets. As Carter delved deeper into the paperwork, he noticed something odd. The date on Rocky's intake form had been altered, a detail so subtle he might have missed it if he hadn't been looking so carefully. The original date had been erased and written over, making it impossible to determine when Rocky had actually been brought in. A soft whimper from Rocky drew Carter's attention. The dog's eyes were fixed on David's cell, his usual professional demeanor replaced by an almost palpable anxiety. In all their years together, Carter had never seen his partner behave this way. Rocky had always been the model of canine discipline. Yet here he was, clearly disturbed by something about this case. David's earlier words echoed in Carter's mind. The story about his lost puppy seemed too specific to be a convenient fabrication. He had described distinctive markings that matched Rocky's perfectly, including a small white patch behind his left ear that wasn't mentioned in any of the official canine unit documents. Carter decided to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding Rocky's discovery. He accessed the department's archived reports from that period, searching for any mention of found dogs matching Rocky's description. As he scrolled through the files, he discovered that several pages from that time frame were missing, marked as administratively removed by a senior officer. The timestamp on the removal order caught his attention. It was from the same day Rocky had been brought in. Even more intriguing was the signature at the bottom of the order. Officer Michael Harris. Carter sat back in his chair, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Harris had been a patrol officer then, without the authority to authorize such removals. Mrs. Thompson returned to the station later that evening, this time with additional information. There's something else you should know, she said, her voice lowered conspiratorially. I saw someone else that night, someone wearing the same type of cap as Mr. Anderson, but this person was different, taller, lighter-skinned. He left the store shortly after the alarm went off, but nobody seemed to notice him. Carter listened intently, jotting down notes as Mrs. Thompson spoke. Her description of the second person was detailed and consistent, suggesting she was indeed a reliable witness. She mentioned specific details about the man's clothing and his hurried departure from the scene, details that aligned with the timeline of events, but had been completely overlooked in the initial investigation. As the night progressed, Carter noticed something else unusual. The security camera footage from the street corner near the 711 Downtown Greenwich, typically archived automatically on the department's servers, was also missing. According to the system log, it had been accessed and deleted just minutes before the backup units arrived at the scene. Rocky's continued agitation and apparent recognition of David weighed heavily on Carter's mind. In their years together, the dog had never failed in his training, never hesitated during an arrest. His behavior tonight wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. Carter had learned to trust Rocky's instincts implicitly, and right now, Those instincts were telling him something was very wrong with this case. Looking through his window, Carter could see Officer Harris in an animated discussion with the precinct captain. Harris's face was flushed, his gestures more aggressive than usual, as he apparently argued for keeping David in custody, despite the lack of evidence. The veteran officer's unusual investment in this case added another layer of suspicion to an already complicated situation. The following morning, Carter arrived early at the station, determined to uncover the truth behind the inconsistencies that had been plaguing him. The rain had finally stopped, but dark clouds still loomed over the city, matching his troubled state of mind. Rocky padded alongside him, his usual confident stride replaced by an anxious energy that seemed to mirror Carter's own unease. As they passed the holding cells, Rocky immediately perked up, pulling towards David's cell. The man was awake, sitting quietly on the bench, his eyes showing signs of a sleepless night. When he saw Rocky, a faint smile crossed his face, but it was tinged with sadness. "You know, Officer Carter," David said softly, "when Buddy disappeared, I spent months looking for him. I put up posters everywhere, visited every shelter within 50 miles. I never stopped hoping I'd find him someday." Carter observed the interaction between them carefully. Rocky's tail wagged gently, and his eyes remained fixed on David with an intensity that couldn't be dismissed. The dog's behavior defied everything Carter knew about canine training. These highly trained police dogs weren't supposed to show such emotional attachment to suspects. Making his way to his desk, Carter began methodically reviewing the evidence again. He pulled out the original incident report from when Rocky, or possibly Buddy, had been found. Something about the documentation had been bothering him, and now he understood why. The veterinary examination dates didn't match up with the intake forms. According to the records, Rocky had been examined 3 days before he was supposedly found. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Thompson stood there, clutching a small envelope. "Officer Carter, I found something you need to see," she said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. "I have a security camera on my porch. It's not very sophisticated, but it caught something from that night." Carter invited her in, and she carefully removed several printed photographs from the envelope. The images were grainy, but clear enough to show two distinct figures near the 7-Eleven Downtown Greenwich that night. One was clearly David, bending down to help someone on the ground. The other figure, wearing a similar cap but noticeably taller, was captured leaving the store shortly after the alarm was triggered. As Carter examined the photographs, Officer Harris appeared in the hallway, his expression darkening when he saw Mrs. Thompson. "Carter, a word," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion. In the hallway, Harris's demeanor was tense, almost threatening. "You need to stop digging," he warned. "This case is straightforward. We have our suspect. Don't complicate things." But Carter couldn't ignore the mounting evidence suggesting otherwise. Returning to his office, he found Rocky sitting beside Mrs. Thompson, accepting gentle pats from her aged hands. "You know," she mused, "I've been watching that store for 20 years from my window. I know everyone who comes and goes. That other man, the taller one, I've seen him before, always late at night, always when the regular staff isn't around." Carter's instincts told him there was more to Mrs. Thompson's observation than mere coincidence. He began cross-referencing late-night incident reports from the 7-Eleven Downtown Greenwich over the past year. A pattern emerged, several reports of suspicious activity, all occurring during similar late-night hours, all mysteriously resolved without formal investigation. Each of these reports had been handled by Officer Harris. The revelation sent Carter's mind racing. He remembered Harris's unusual behavior the night Rocky was brought in, his insistence on handling the paperwork personally, and now his aggressive stance on David's case. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it wasn't one Carter was prepared to accept without concrete evidence. Mrs. Thompson's photos provided the first solid lead. Carter carefully documented each image, noting the timestamps and angles, but when he returned from making copies, he found his office had been searched. Files were slightly out of place, his computer showed recent activity, and most alarmingly, the original photos were missing from his desk. Rocky's behavior became even more telling as the day progressed. Whenever Harris approached David's cell, the dog would position himself between them, displaying subtle signs of protective behavior. It was the kind of instinctive response that couldn't be faked or trained. It came from a place of genuine recognition and concern. The tension in the station was palpable. Other officers had begun to notice the unusual dynamics at play, particularly the way Harris seemed to be inserting himself into every aspect of the investigation. His insistence on David's guilt, despite the lack of evidence, was raising eyebrows among even the most veteran officers. Late afternoon sun filtered through the precinct windows as Carter sat at his desk, surrounded by scattered reports and documents. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten in the intensity of his investigation. Rocky lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to watch the corridor leading to the holding cells, his ears perking up at every distant sound. Carter had spent the last few hours meticulously piecing together a timeline of events from 5 years ago, when Rocky first joined the force. The more he dug, the more inconsistencies he found. Training records showed gaps that shouldn't exist for a police canine, and several evaluations appeared to have been backdated. Most troubling were the missing pages from the original intake report, pages that should have detailed exactly where and how Rocky had been found. A soft knock interrupted his concentration. Mrs. Thompson stood in the doorway, clutching her worn handbag. "Officer Carter, I've been thinking about that night," she began, settling into the chair across from his desk. "The man I saw, the taller one, I remember something else. He had a distinctive way of walking, favoring his left leg slightly. I've seen that same limp before, right here in the station." Carter's pulse quickened as he recalled Officer Harris's old injury, a legacy from his early days on the force. It wasn't obvious unless you knew to look for it, but Harris did indeed have a slight limp on his left side. The revelation added another piece to the increasingly complex puzzle. As if summoned by their conversation, Harris appeared in the doorway, his face hardening at the sight of Mrs. Thompson. "Carter, the captain wants an update on the case," he announced, his tone clipped. "And Mrs. Thompson, I believe we have all the information we need from you. You can go home now." But Mrs. Thompson stood her ground, her aged frame straightening with determination. "Actually, Officer Harris, I have something else to share with Officer Carter. Something about the night Rocky was found 5 years ago. I remember because it was the same night my grandson was visiting, and we saw something peculiar from my window." Harris's reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. A slight tensing of his shoulders, a barely perceptible shift in his stance. "That's ancient history," he dismissed, but there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. "We need to focus on the current case." After Harris left clearly agitated, Mrs. Thompson leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That night, 5 years ago, I saw someone forcing a young dog into a car. The poor thing was frightened, trying to resist. I called the police, but when they came, Officer Harris told me they'd look into it. Nothing ever came of it." Carter felt a chill run down his spine. The timing aligned perfectly with Rocky's mysterious appearance at the precinct. He glanced down at his partner, who had risen to his feet, ears forward, fully alert. The dog's reaction to Harris had been growing increasingly defensive over the past day, a stark contrast to their previously cordial relationship. As Carter processed this new information, he noticed David watching from his cell, his expression thoughtful. During a quiet moment, David shared more about Buddy's disappearance. "It happened so suddenly," he explained, his voice heavy with old grief. "Buddy was in our fenced backyard. The gate was locked. 1 minute he was there, the next, gone. No holes in the fence, no signs of escape, just vanished. The parallels were becoming impossible to ignore." Carter pulled up Harris's personnel records, focusing on his assignments from 5 years ago. During that period, Harris had been working in David's neighborhood, handling routine patrol duties. The coincidence seemed less and less like chance with each new detail. Meanwhile, Rocky's behavior continued to evolve. The normally disciplined canine had begun responding to subtle gestures from David, movements that seemed familiar between them. During exercise periods in the secured yard, Rocky would naturally gravitate toward David's cell window, sitting below it as if standing guard. Carter's investigation was interrupted by an urgent call from the 711 Downtown Greenwich manager. "Officer Carter? I found something strange in our backup system," the manager reported, his voice nervous. "There's a shadow copy of the security footage from that night. It's corrupted, but there might be something salvageable. This discovery could be the breakthrough they needed." But Carter knew he had to move carefully. Harris's increasing agitation and the mysterious disappearance of evidence suggested someone was actively working to control the narrative. The question was no longer just about what had happened at the 711 Downtown Greenwich. It had evolved into something much larger, stretching back 5 years to a night when a puppy named Buddy vanished without a trace. The backup footage from the 711 Downtown Greenwich arrived in a damaged hard drive, its contents fragmented but not completely lost. Carter hunched over his computer, working with the IT department to salvage what they could. Each recovered frame could potentially reveal the truth about that rainy night. Rocky sat alertly beside him, his eyes never leaving the screen, as if he too understood the importance of what they might find. As the technical team worked their magic, Carter received another visit from Mrs. Thompson. This time she brought something unexpected, an old photo album. "I've always been a bit of a shutterbug," she explained, carefully turning the pages. "I take pictures of everything in the neighborhood, been doing it for years. Sometimes the most ordinary photos capture extraordinary moments." She stopped at a page dated 5 years ago. There, in a seemingly innocent snapshot of her garden, the background revealed something crucial, a partial view of the street where a police cruiser was parked. Though grainy, the image clearly showed someone matching Harris's description, bending down near a frightened young dog. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Mrs. Thompson continued, her aged fingers trembling slightly as they traced the photograph's edge. "But when I saw how Rocky responded to Mr. Anderson, something clicked. The way that officer was handling the dog, it wasn't gentle, it wasn't right." Carter carefully documented the photograph, making multiple copies and securing them in different locations. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The timestamp on the photo aligned perfectly with the day Buddy disappeared from David's backyard, adding another layer of verification to their growing body of evidence. Meanwhile, the IT team made a breakthrough with the corrupted security footage. Though partially damaged, several clear frames emerged, showing the sequence of events from the night of the incident. The footage revealed 2 distinct individuals: David, clearly visible helping someone on the ground, and another figure, taller and lighter skinned, exiting the store shortly after the alarm was triggered. As Carter reviewed the recovered footage, he noticed something else. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was Officer Harris's personal vehicle parked in an alley where it shouldn't have been. The timestamp showed it was there well before the alarm went off, before any officers had been dispatched to the scene. The implications were staggering. Carter began connecting the dots. Harris's unexpected presence before the alarm, his aggressive insistence on David's guilt, his history of manipulating evidence, and his connection to Rocky's mysterious appearance on the force. A pattern of deception emerged, stretching back years. David, still in his cell, shared more details about the day Buddy disappeared. "I was at school," he explained, his voice steady but filled with old pain. "My mother was home, but she had stepped inside for just a few minutes. When she came back out, Buddy was gone. We searched everywhere, filed reports, but the investigating officer kept insisting we must have left the gate open. He wouldn't listen to anything else." Carter pulled the old report from David's missing dog case. The investigating officer's signature was partially obscured, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Officer Michael Harris had handled that case too. The same officer who had found Rocky wandering the streets, who had pushed for his rapid integration into the K-9 unit, bypassing several standard protocols in the process. As the day progressed, other officers began noticing Harris's increasingly erratic behavior. He was making frequent phone calls from the parking lot, away from the station's recorded lines. His usual confidence had been replaced by a nervous energy, and he kept finding reasons to pass by Carter's office, clearly trying to monitor the investigation's progress. The technical team made another crucial discovery in the corrupted footage. In one frame, the taller suspect's face was briefly illuminated by the store's security lights. Though slightly blurred, the image showed enough detail to raise serious questions about Harris's involvement in the case. Rocky's reaction to these developments became increasingly pronounced. During one of Harris's passes by the office, the dog moved to position himself between Harris and Carter's desk, his posture alert and protective. It was a subtle but clear indication of the dog's shifting loyalties and growing distrust of the veteran officer. Mrs. Thompson, who had become an unexpected ally in the investigation, continued to provide valuable insights. "You know," she mused, watching Rocky's protective behavior, "animals have a way of remembering. They might not understand human complexities, but they never forget kindness or cruelty. They carry those memories in their hearts." The weight of accumulated evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Carter sat in his office, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across his desk as he organized the growing file of inconsistencies surrounding both the 7-11-0 Downtown Greenwich incident and Rocky's history. Rocky lay nearby, his eyes fixed on the holding cell area, maintaining his vigil even as exhaustion began to show in his posture. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Officer Harris was engaged in a heated discussion with the captain, their voices carrying through the thin walls. "This is a waste of resources," Harris insisted, his voice sharp with barely contained anger. "We have a suspect in custody. Carter's wild theories are just muddying the waters." The captain's response was measured but firm. "Officer Carter's concerns merit investigation. The evidence he's uncovered raises serious questions that we cannot ignore." Harris's face reddened, a vein pulsing at his temple as he struggled to maintain his composure. As Carter watched this exchange, Mrs. Thompson appeared at his door once again, this time with a manila envelope clutched in her trembling hands. "I found these in my attic," she whispered, glancing nervously at Harris's back. "I used to keep a diary, you see, and I wrote down everything I saw from my window, including that night 5 years ago." Inside the envelope were pages of neat handwriting, documenting daily life in the neighborhood. The entry from the night of Buddy's disappearance was particularly detailed. Mrs. Thompson had recorded not only the incident with the dog, but also the license plate number of the vehicle involved, a number that matched Harris's personal car from that period. Meanwhile, the IT department had managed to recover more fragments from the security footage. The new section showed the actual sequence of events at the 7-11-0 Downtown Greenwich. David helping an injured homeless person, the real perpetrator leaving the scene, and most damningly, Officer Harris's early arrival and suspicious behavior before backup was called. The evidence was mounting, but Harris's influence in the department made the situation delicate. Several officers who had initially supported Carter's investigation began to distance themselves, aware of Harris's reputation for holding grudges. The pressure was building, and Carter could feel the weight of professional isolation settling around him. David, watching from his cell, seemed to sense the shifting dynamics. During an interview, he revealed more details about the day Buddy disappeared. "There was a police officer who used to patrol our street," he recalled, his voice thoughtful. "He would always stop and watch Buddy when we were in the yard. Something about the way he looked at my dog made me uncomfortable, but I told myself I was being paranoid." As David spoke, Rocky's behavior became increasingly agitated. The dog paced between David's cell and Carter's office, whining softly as if trying to communicate something urgent. His reaction to Harris had evolved from mere distrust to obvious anxiety, raising hackles whenever the veteran officer approached. The situation reached a critical point when Carter discovered his office had been searched again. This time, however, the intruder had made a mistake. The station's recently installed security cameras had captured Harris entering the office late at night, rifling through files and attempting to access Carter's computer. Mrs. Thompson's continued presence at the station hadn't gone unnoticed. Harris confronted her in the hallway, his attempt at intimidation barely disguised as concern. "Haven't you spent enough time here?" he asked, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "A woman your age should be at home, resting." But Mrs. Thompson stood her ground, drawing herself up to her full height despite her advanced years. "Officer Harris," she replied, her voice unwavering, "I've watched this neighborhood for decades. I've seen things people think went unnoticed. Perhaps it's time all those things came to light." The tension in the station was reaching a breaking point. Other officers began to notice discrepancies in Harris's behavior, particularly his obsession with the case, and his increasingly aggressive attempts to control the narrative. The captain, too, was paying closer attention, quietly gathering information and observing the unfolding situation. As Carter reviewed the mounting evidence, a clear pattern emerged. Harris's involvement in both cases, Buddy's disappearance and the 711 Downtown Greenwich incident, suggested a troubling history of manipulation and abuse of power. The question was no longer whether Harris was involved, but how to prove it definitively without putting David or the investigation at risk. Thunder rumbled in the distance as another storm approached the city. Carter stood by the window of his office, watching dark clouds gather while Rocky sat alertly beside him. The atmosphere in the station had become as heavy as the weather outside, charged with unspoken tensions and mounting suspicions. The captain had just finished reviewing Carter's collected evidence, his expression growing more concerned with each document. The security footage showing Harris entering Carter's office unauthorized misses. Thompson's detailed diary entries, the photographs, and the growing stack of inconsistencies in official reports painted a disturbing picture of long-term manipulation. "Officer Carter," the captain said, closing the last file, "this goes beyond our current case. These discrepancies in Harris's records, his unauthorized access to files, the convenient disappearance of evidence, it suggests a pattern of behavior that we cannot ignore." Before they could discuss further actions, a commotion erupted in the holding area. David had suffered a panic attack triggered by Harris's latest intimidation attempt. The veteran officer had been seen approaching David's cell, speaking in low tones that the cameras couldn't pick up, but the effect on David was immediate and visible. Rocky's reaction was instantaneous. The usually disciplined canine rushed to the holding area, positioning himself between Harris and David's cell, his posture protective rather than aggressive. The dog's behavior caught the attention of every officer present, many of whom had never seen such a clear break from training protocols. Mrs. Thompson arrived at that moment clutching a weathered envelope. "I found something else," she announced, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Photos from my neighborhood watch meetings. We used to document suspicious activities, you see, and there's something here you need to see." The photographs she produced showed Harris's personal vehicle parked near David's house multiple times in the weeks leading up to Buddy's disappearance. In several images, Harris could be seen watching the house, his attention focused on the backyard where Buddy would play. The timestamps and locations were meticulously documented, typical of Mrs. Thompson's careful nature. As Carter examined the new evidence, Harris burst into the office, his face flushed with anger. "This has gone far enough," he demanded, reaching for the photographs. But Rocky moved quickly, placing himself between Harris and Carter's desk, his warning growl filling the room. The dog's reaction was so uncharacteristic that even Harris stepped back, momentarily losing his aggressive stance. The captain, who had witnessed the entire scene, made a decision. "Officer Harris, surrender your badge and weapon. You're suspended pending an internal investigation." The words fell like thunder in the suddenly quiet office. Harris's face went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, fear, before settling into a cold mask. "You're making a mistake," Harris said, his voice dangerously low. "All this over a stray dog and a criminal? You're willing to throw away years of service based on some old woman's imagination and a few coincidences." But Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished. She pulled out one final piece of evidence, a video recording from her home security system from 5 years ago. "I installed these cameras after a series of burglaries," she explained. "They're not the best quality, but they record everything day and night, and they never forget." The footage, though grainy, clearly showed Harris approaching David's backyard gate late one night. The timestamp matched the day of Buddy's disappearance. In the video, a young dog could be seen being led away, struggling against a leash. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning when combined with everything else they had uncovered. Carter watched as the color drained from Harris's face. The veteran officer's carefully constructed facade began to crack, revealing the desperation beneath. Years of manipulation and abuse of power were unraveling in front of him, triggered by a chance encounter between a canine officer and his long-lost companion. Rocky's behavior had become the catalyst for exposing a truth that had been buried for 5 years. The dog's unwavering recognition of David, his growing distrust of Harris, and his break from training protocols All pointed to a history that couldn't be explained away by coincidence. The suspension of Officer Harris sent shockwaves through the precinct. Officers gathered in small groups, discussing the revelations in hushed tones. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the station floor, as Carter continued piecing together the full extent of Harris's deceptions. Harris's personnel file had been opened for review, revealing a history of complaints that had somehow been buried or dismissed. Most troubling were the numerous instances where evidence had gone missing in cases he supervised, always explained away with plausible excuses that no one had thought to question. Until now, Mrs. Thompson had become a regular presence at the station, her quiet dignity and detailed records providing a foundation for the investigation. "You know," she said, sorting through more of her photographs, "I always wondered why that police car would park near my house at odd hours. Now I understand he was watching, waiting for the right moment." The 711 Downtown Greenwich manager arrived with additional recovered footage, this time showing clear evidence of tampering with the security system before the alarm was triggered. The timestamp matched Harris's arrival time, proving he had been on the scene well before the incident was reported. David, still in his cell but now under protective supervision, shared more details about the days leading up to Buddy's disappearance. Officer Harris would often stop by our house, claiming he was doing routine neighborhood checks. He seemed particularly interested in Buddy, always asking questions about his training, his temperament. I thought he was just being friendly. Rocky's behavior continued to evolve, showing increasingly clear signs of recognition and attachment to David. During exercise periods, the dog would perform tricks that weren't part of his police training, tricks that David remembered teaching Buddy. These demonstrations became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The captain called Carter into his office for a private meeting. "We found something disturbing," he said, spreading out a series of documents. Harris's bank records showed deposits from a private security firm around the time Rocky was brought into the force. The same firm had been trying to purchase trained dogs for their operations. This revelation suggested a deeper motive behind Harris's actions. He hadn't just taken Buddy on a whim. There had been a calculated plan to acquire a trainable dog for profit. The fact that he had kept Rocky instead pointed to something going wrong with the original scheme. Mrs. Thompson provided another crucial piece of information. The night Buddy disappeared, I saw Officer Harris making a call from his car. He seemed agitated, arguing with someone. The next day, he was back on regular patrol as if nothing had happened, but Rocky, or Buddy, was suddenly part of the police force. Carter reviewed the K-9 unit's training records again, this time noting how Harris had pushed for Rocky's rapid integration into the force, bypassing standard procedures and evaluations. His influence had ensured that questions about the dog's origins were never properly investigated. The evidence was mounting, but Harris's years of service and connections within the department complicated matters. Some officers, particularly those who had benefited from Harris's protection over the years, remained skeptical of the allegations. The tension in the station grew as lines were drawn between those supporting the investigation and those defending Harris. Rocky's reaction to these developments was telling. The dog had become increasingly protective of both Carter and David, as if sensing the growing conflict within the department. His behavior around other officers who had been close to Harris became cautious, suggesting he remembered more than anyone had suspected. A junior officer approached Carter with information he had been afraid to share earlier. "I was on duty the night Rocky was brought in," he admitted. "Harris told me to backdate the intake forms and never mention seeing him with the dog before that night. I knew it was wrong, but he was my superior officer." This testimony added another layer to the case against Harris. The systematic way he had covered his tracks, manipulated evidence, and silenced potential witnesses pointed to a level of calculation that went beyond a simple case of taking someone's pet. It revealed a pattern of corruption that had gone unchecked for years. The afternoon brought new developments that shook the precinct to its core. An anonymous tip led Carter to a storage facility on the outskirts of town. Inside, a unit registered under a false name, but paid for with Harris's credit card, they found a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Falsified documents, old case files, and most damning of all, Buddy's original collar and tags, still bearing David's contact information. The discovery sent ripples through the department. Officers who had been hesitant to believe the allegations against Harris could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. The captain ordered a complete review of all cases Harris had handled over the past 5 years, revealing a pattern of manipulated evidence and suspicious coincidences that had gone unnoticed for far too long. Mrs. Thompson arrived at the station with another crucial piece of evidence. "I found these in my old files," she said, presenting a series of photographs taken from her window over the years. "I always photograph suspicious activities, you see. These show Officer Harris's car parked outside my house on multiple occasions, always late at night, always when he wasn't supposed to be on duty." The photos revealed more than just Harris's unauthorized surveillance. In several images, he could be seen meeting with individuals in unmarked vehicles, exchanging packages and envelopes. The timestamps corresponded with cases where evidence had mysteriously disappeared or been altered. Meanwhile, David's time in custody had revealed more connections. During an interview with Carter, he recalled details that seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried new weight. "The week before Buddy disappeared, I saw Officer Harris talking to someone in a car outside our house. When I asked him about it later, he said he was conducting routine surveillance. But something felt off about his explanation." Rocky's behavior continued to provide undeniable evidence of his true identity. During one interaction with David, the dog responded to a series of unique commands that David had taught Buddy, commands that had never been part of his police training. The demonstration was witnessed by several officers, including some who had initially doubted the connection. The 7/11 Downtown Greenwich investigation took an unexpected turn when the manager discovered additional backup footage stored on an old server. The new videos showed Harris entering the store before the alarm was triggered, speaking with someone off camera. The timestamp matched perfectly with Mrs. Thompson's diary entries about suspicious activity she had observed that night. Carter's investigation revealed another troubling detail. The private security firm that had made payments to Harris's account was connected to a series of similar incidents in neighboring counties, cases where trained dogs had disappeared only to resurface in various security operations. The pattern suggested a larger operation that Harris had potentially been involved with. The pressure began to show on Harris's supporters within the department. Several officers came forward with information they had previously withheld, describing instances where Harris had asked them to modify reports or look the other way during questionable arrests. Each new revelation added another piece to the puzzle of corruption that had been hidden in plain sight. Mrs. Thompson's documentation proved invaluable as the investigation deepened. Her meticulous notes and photographs provided a timeline that corroborated other evidence and witness statements. "I always believed that someday these records would matter," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "The truth has a way of coming to light, even if it takes years." The relationship between Rocky and David grew stronger with each passing day. During supervised visits, the dog displayed behaviors that only someone who had raised him would recognize. Specific reactions to certain phrases, unique playful gestures that had been part of their shared past. These moments were carefully documented, adding to the growing body of evidence. As Carter reviewed all the gathered information, a clear picture emerged of how Harris had orchestrated both Buddy's disappearance and the recent 7/11 Downtown Greenwich incident. His years of manipulating evidence and intimidating witnesses had created a web of deception that was finally beginning to unravel, exposing the true extent of his actions. The truth about Harris's activities had created a seismic shift within the department. Officers who had once looked up to him now struggled to reconcile his reputation with the mounting evidence of his misdeeds. The captain had called an emergency meeting to address the situation, but Harris was nowhere to be found. Carter sat at his desk, reviewing the latest developments with growing concern. Rocky lay at his feet, more alert than usual, as if sensing the tension in the air. The dog's head snapped up at the sound of footsteps approaching. It was Mrs. Thompson, clutching a worn leather-bound notebook. "I've been keeping this since the day Buddy disappeared," she explained, carefully opening the notebook. "Every suspicious incident, every unusual occurrence in our neighborhood. I never imagined they would all connect like this." The pages revealed a detailed chronicle of Harris's activities over the years, including dates, times, and descriptions that matched perfectly with other evidence they had uncovered. David, still under protective custody, had been helping piece together the timeline of events. His detailed recollections of the days leading up to Buddy's disappearance provided crucial context to Mrs. Thompson's observations. Harris would park across the street, David explained, watching our house for hours. I remember Buddy becoming increasingly agitated whenever he was around. The 7-Eleven, a downtown Greenwich manager, had made another breakthrough. While reviewing old security logs, he discovered that the system had been accessed remotely on the night of the incident. The IP address traced back to a computer in Harris's home office. This digital footprint proved he had planned the evidence tampering well in advance. More officers began coming forward with their own stories. A senior detective revealed that Harris had pressured him to modify reports in several cases, always with the same justification: for the greater good of the department. The pattern of manipulation extended far beyond Buddy's case, suggesting years of systematic abuse of power. Rocky's behavior had become increasingly significant as the investigation progressed. During one session, David demonstrated a series of unique hand signals he had taught Buddy. The dog's immediate and accurate responses to these commands left no doubt about his true identity. The officers present watched in amazement as Rocky performed tricks that had never been part of his police training. Mrs. Thompson's documentation provided another crucial piece of evidence. Among her photographs was a series taken the night Buddy disappeared, showing Harris's car parked near David's house. In one image, barely visible but unmistakable, was a dog carrier in his back seat, the same type used later to transport Rocky to the police academy. The investigation took an unexpected turn when a former employee of the private security firm came forward. They revealed that Harris had been part of a larger scheme to acquire trained dogs for private security operations. However, something had gone wrong with Buddy's case. Instead of delivering the dog as planned, Harris had kept him, creating an elaborate cover story about finding a stray. Carter's office had become the center of the investigation, with walls covered in timeline charts and connected evidence. The captain stood before the display, shaking his head in disbelief. How did we miss this for so long, he wondered aloud. The signs were there, but we chose not to see them. As they reviewed the evidence, Rocky's attention suddenly shifted to the window. His posture changed, becoming alert and focused. Outside, a familiar car had pulled into the parking lot, Harris's vehicle. The suspended officer hadn't turned in his department credentials, and now he had returned to the station unannounced. The tension in the room became palpable. Through the window, they could see Harris sitting in his car, apparently making phone calls. His presence created an immediate sense of unease, especially given the sensitive nature of the evidence they had just uncovered. Rocky's reaction to Harris's arrival was telling. The dog moved closer to David's cell, his protective instincts clearly visible. The presence of Harris's car in the parking lot created an immediate ripple of tension through the station. Carter watched as the suspended officer finally emerged from his vehicle, his movements deliberate and controlled. The captain immediately ordered additional security measures, ensuring all evidence was secured, and David's cell was under extra surveillance. Inside the station, Rocky's behavior became increasingly agitated. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the entrance, his posture tense and alert. Mrs. Thompson, who had refused to leave despite the growing tension, clutched her evidence files closer. "There's something else you need to see," she whispered, pulling out another photograph. "I took this the day after Buddy disappeared." The image showed Harris removing something from his garage in the early morning hours. A dog training collar and leash that matched the ones found in the storage unit. The timestamp aligned perfectly with the timeline they had constructed, providing another crucial piece of evidence linking Harris to Buddy's disappearance. As Harris entered the building, the atmosphere grew thick with tension. He walked through the station as if he still commanded authority, ignoring the wary glances from his former colleagues. When he approached Carter's office, Rocky positioned himself protectively between the door and David's cell, his training warring with his instincts. "You've caused quite a stir, Carter," Harris said, his voice carrying an edge of dangerous calm. "Digging up ancient history, making accusations based on an old woman's imagination, and a dog's behavior. Is this really how you want to proceed?" Before Carter could respond, Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her small frame somehow filling the space between them. "I may be old, Officer Harris, but my memory and my camera have preserved the truth you tried to bury. Every late-night visit, every suspicious meeting, every moment you thought went unobserved, it's all documented." The captain arrived with several officers, having been alerted to Harris's presence. "Michael," he said firmly, "you're not supposed to be here. Your suspension terms were clear, but Harris seemed beyond caring about protocols now." His carefully maintained facade was cracking, revealing glimpses of the desperation beneath. "You don't understand what you're doing," Harris insisted, his voice rising. "I built this department's canine unit from nothing. Everything I did was for the greater good. One stray dog, one minor incident, and you're willing to throw away years of service." His words hung in the air, but they carried a hollow ring of justification that no one was buying anymore. The evidence spoke for itself. The manipulated reports, the suspicious payments, the systematic abuse of power that had gone unchecked for years. David, watching from his cell, spoke up for the first time since Harris's arrival. "He wasn't a stray," he said quietly but firmly. "Buddy was family, and you took him, trained him to forget who he was. All for what? Money? Power?" Harris's composure finally broke. "You think this was just about one dog?" He spat. "The private security contracts, the training programs. Do you have any idea how much money was involved? I had connections, opportunities. But then this one dog wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't forget his old life. I had to keep him, train him myself. It was the only way to salvage something from the situation." His confession, spoken in anger, echoed through the suddenly silent station. The captain nodded to two officers, who moved to take Harris into custody. But before they could reach him, Harris made a desperate move toward Carter's desk, where the evidence files lay spread out. Rocky reacted instantly, not with aggression, but with pure protective instinct. He placed himself firmly between Harris and the desk, his posture clearly communicating that he would not allow any more interference with the truth. The dog's stance, neither aggressive nor fearful, spoke volumes about his true nature and his true identity. Mrs. Thompson quietly raised her phone, capturing one final piece of evidence: Harris's reaction to being thwarted by the very dog he had stolen and tried to remake in his own image. The moment perfectly encapsulated the unraveling of years of deception, caught in the unwavering lens of justice that had been quietly watching all along. In the days following Harris's confession, the station underwent a profound transformation. The truth had shaken the department to its core, but it had also opened the door for healing and renewal. Carter sat at his desk, watching as Rocky, now officially acknowledged as Buddy, interacted with both his original family and his police colleagues. The captain had made an unprecedented decision. Given Buddy's exceptional training and the unique circumstances of his case, he proposed a shared custody arrangement. The dog would continue his valuable work with the police department, while also spending time with David and his family, honoring both his professional training and his personal bonds. Mrs. Thompson's documentation had become the foundation for a complete departmental review. Her meticulous records, spanning years of observation, had exposed not just Harris's actions, but also highlighted the importance of community vigilance. The captain had invited her to help establish a new civilian oversight committee, recognizing that sometimes the most valuable witnesses were the quiet observers in the community. David's release was accompanied by a formal apology from the department. The 7-11 Downtown Greenwich incident had been fully clarified. Security footage showed the real perpetrator, a local troublemaker, who had already confessed after being identified through Mrs. Thompson's photographs. David's actions that night had been exactly as described, helping an injured homeless person, demonstrating the kind of compassion that reflected his character. The discovery of Harris's broader scheme had led to investigations in neighboring counties. Several other cases of missing dogs had been connected to the private security firm, and families were finally getting answers about their lost pets. Harris's detailed records, found in his storage unit, helped authorities begin the process of making amends. Carter watched as Buddy demonstrated his dual nature. One moment, performing complex police maneuvers, the next responding to David's childhood training commands with pure joy. The dog had somehow managed to maintain both identities, his loyalty divided not by confusion, but by an extraordinary capacity for love and service. "You know," Mrs. Thompson mused, watching Buddy with David, "sometimes the truth doesn't just set us free, it shows us how to be better." She had become a regular presence at the station, her quiet wisdom and sharp observational skills now valued assets rather than overlooked resources. The captain implemented new protocols inspired by the case. Every canine officer would now have their history thoroughly documented with multiple checks and balances to prevent any future abuse of the system. The changes weren't just procedural, they represented a fundamental shift in how the department approached transparency and community trust. David's relationship with the department had evolved from suspicion to collaboration. His experience had led to him being invited to participate in community outreach programs, sharing his story to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the public. His presence reminded everyone that behind every case, there were real people with real stories. Buddy's adaptation to his dual life proved remarkably smooth. During the day, he worked alongside Carter, maintaining his role as a highly trained police canine. Evenings and weekends were spent with David and his family, rekindling the bonds of his early life. The arrangement seemed to bring out the best in him, as if he had finally found a way to be true to all aspects of his identity. Carter had learned profound lessons from the case. The experience had taught him to question his assumptions, to look beyond the surface of situations, and to recognize that sometimes the most important evidence came from the heart. His partnership with Buddy had evolved into something deeper, a shared commitment to both justice and compassion. As the sun set on another day at the station, Carter watched Buddy leave with David, the dog's tail wagging with happy anticipation. Tomorrow he would return to his police duties, but for now, he was simply a family pet, reunited with his first friend. The sight reminded Carter that sometimes the best resolutions weren't about choosing between two worlds, but finding a way to honor both. Today's story has taken us on a journey full of unexpected twists and deep emotions. From what seemed like ordinary events in life, we've uncovered profound connections, hidden secrets from the past, and traces that we thought might have been forgotten. The loyalty of the K9, the determination of the officer, and the strange events that unfolded created a story that is not only captivating, but also deeply human. This tale reminds us that in life, nothing happens by chance. Every action has meaning, and sometimes the unexplainable events are the ones that carry the most significant truths. If you found this story intriguing and want to dive into more like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Every story we share is carefully selected, filled with exciting, mysterious, and inspiring details. Join us on this journey as we uncover more hidden truths behind seemingly ordinary events. Be sure to share this video with your friends and family because they might feel just like you, connected to a part of the vast world we never knew existed. Thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you in our next story.